Hi, I'm Paul Tunnah. Welcome to the next edition of my Health Innovators video series, and really pleased today to be joined by Billy Boyle of Owlstone Medical. It's a company I've been sort of monitoring for a while and they're doing some really interesting stuff, and you've probably heard about their breath biopsy testing for cancer. So Billy, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Paul. Very happy to be here.
So we'll start with a question I bet you've answered many a times. I'd love to hear a bit more about, your journey from, being at university, academia, into starting Owlstone and then Owlstone Medical. How did that all come about?
Yeah, sure. So I originally grew up in Ireland and then went to study engineering at Cambridge. I was always a bit of a geek as a child, loved electronics, loved computers. So engineering was a course I really enjoyed. And after that, I stayed on as a researcher working in the microsystems and MEMS group at the engineering department. And that's where we really got interested in gas sensing. So looking at different chemicals in the ambient environment and how you could use new manufacturing techniques, so microfabrication techniques, to make devices smaller, cheaper, better, basically. And I think we always had in mind, could we develop chemical sensor technology that could look at markers on breath and urine, etc., for diagnostic applications, but realized that was quite far off. So a lot of the original focus when we first spun out was around industrial and security applications. So this is things like detection of toxic gases in industrial applications, things like contamination of crude oil and water and those types of things. So we were quite lucky in that we raised about $75 million of investment into that business. About half was from contracts we won primarily from US governments and UK government, and the other half was US-based VC money. And that allowed us to develop our sensor technology, build that into products, and then we've sold those products all over the world. And I think what's interesting and nice about the core sensor technology is that you can change what you detect just by changing software on it. So it's always the same core silicon device. And we started to sell instruments into the academic research market. So we'd have clinical and academic researchers saying, hey, we're interested in volatile organic compounds on breath as potential biomarkers of disease. So essentially, we were selling instruments. They were going to often run in different studies. But what was interesting was they started to publish more and more papers. And we were looking at saying, actually, some of these results look pretty good. It looks like there's potentially interest in biomarkers, VOCS biomarkers, and everything from colon cancer to asthma. And around that same time, my own wife was diagnosed with late-stage colon cancer. And that's when I really got an appreciation of the importance of early detection. So survival chances are 10 times better when you pick it up at early stage. So I think it was, those two things happening around the same time. It's like, okay, early detection is a massive problem for society. And actually, our technology and VOCs may have a role to play here. But we realize it's obviously a totally different business. So, the funding needs, the need to run large-scale clinical trials. So that was all very different. So we decided to spin Owlstone Medical out as a separate company in 2016. So kind of taking the technology and the team with us, but kind of razor focusing on some of these medical and diagnostic applications. I think we've been lucky since then. We've grown to a team of about 170, and we've raised close to $100 million of investment as well. And I think when we spun the business out, it was about trying to get a clear alignment to what difference can technology make. So we have a company mission to try and save 100,000 lives by building better tests and early detection and precision medicine applications.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and obviously sorry to hear about the story with your wife, but it's incredible how that can be turned into a positive with the work that you're doing. And something I see more and more actually in the tech space, in healthcare and pharma, people taking that personal experience and doing something really positive with it. You make the story sort of sound almost quite easy in terms of your starting and where you are now. I'm sure it's not been, because moving from academia into the commercial side, it has its own challenges. What were some of the sort of hiccups you faced early on?
No, you're right. There's a lot of problems and challenges, both in the past and in the future as well. I think, having come from an engineering background, me and the other co-founders, we didn't have any commercial experience at all. But I think we were fortunate in that when we first spun out, there was quite a supportive and vibrant entrepreneur community within Cambridge. So actually, a lot of people in the Cambridge area who built successful companies are very willing to help young people try and build businesses, and that was great, because I think it meant that in those days, I remember the first sale we ever made of our chip was like for $100 or something like that. Like, well, we need to do this many times in order to actually grow into a significant business. So we had to do things like evolve our business model, move from just making chips to instruments, so higher in the value chain. And then I think, trying to sell into some of the markets there was quite challenging. So selling into defense and security applications, is a tough business. So there's a lot of kind of binary risks. You get the big contract or you don't. And there's a lot of regulatory type considerations as well. So I think actually that was a good proving ground for us, in the sense that it matured the technology, but it also meant that we developed a very deep understanding of the detection of VOCs right across all the different things you need to do. And some of it is very, boring but important stuff, like how do you ensure cleanliness in a lab environment and manufacturing environment, stuff like that. So I think it put us in good stead when we thought about moving into the medical business. But actually, once we transitioned into medical, again, the challenges were totally different. So there we didn't have any experience of building medical devices or running clinical trials. And actually, again, it's the support of others that really helped us. I remember speaking to CR UK, who were really interested in trying to see, is there technologies that sit outside of healthcare that can be brought across and help to address early cancer detection problem. So they were great. I spoke to them as we've got this little chip. It might be useful in cancer detection. We don't know. Can you help us? And they put us in contact with some of the kind of leading PIs in Cambridge that are now running some of our big studies as well. So I think that was really quite powerful and helpful for us. And I think one of the really big challenges that we observed and overcome in the early phases was, when you look at breath analysis, people have been talking about it for a while. So the raging skeptic in me was like, if it's so great, where are all the tests? And
it sounds beautifully simple, doesn't it, as a solution?
Yeah, exactly. It's non-invasive, fantastic from a patient perspective. But again, the skeptic in me is like, what's the problem here? And actually, there were some very basic foundational issues, like how do you get a good sample? So if you don't get a good sample, you don't get the right answer, irrespective of how you analyze it. So I think that's where our experience of working with very low levels of gas detection was very relevant. It allowed us to build a device called Receiver, which essentially solves the sample collection problem. So you can collect VOCs from breath, stabilize it, analyze it later. So I think that was one big area, but actually probably the most significant challenge, and it's one that the field still faces today, was around the core biomarker discovery and validation problem. Because I think we had a sensor technology, and again, you can program it to detect compounds of interest. So in our mind, we thought this is going to be easy. There's been a bunch of papers published in lung cancer detection. Program our chip, we'll have a test. But actually, what we found was that pretty much all of these studies, they were small initial pilot studies. They hadn't been replicated. Those markers hadn't been validated in large, prospective, independent studies as well. So actually, while we had a technology that could look at specific compounds, the $1 million question is, what is it you actually need to detect in those different applications? So that's where we realized this is actually a lot harder And we've had to build, a very comprehensive GC mass spec capability in our facility as well to help address that core discovery question. So I think lots of challenges in the past and in the future as well.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear you talk about that. And it's something I hear very commonly from, to broadly class digital health startups in this kind of space. Is there's lots of small samples, like you say, we've got 100 patients here and it's done this. And that's great. But then, of course, the regulators and the payers look at it and go, well, that's nice, but. And then you head into the realms, don't you, of clinical trials and starting to feel a bit like a biotech, which I know is a journey that you've been on. So where are you with the clinical trials at the moment and that process?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So we realized that, you need to be thinking about larger scale studies from the outset, validation as part of those studies as well. Because again, our goals are different. Our goals are to try and find a biomarker and get a test into the marketplace, as opposed to, maybe publish a paper and move on to the next thing. So we're focused on, I would say, 3 key areas. One is early detection of lung cancer, others in liver disease and natural Dinesh, looking at diagnosis and disease progression, and then also in respiratory disease, so trying to determine what type of inflammation a patient might have to help steer therapy choice. So there's kind of 3 horses in the race, if you like, because for any given trial, you don't know at the outset what will work and what
doesn't. Yeah.
So I think we approach it from the standpoint of saying, is there a clinical need? Yes. Is there a reasonable biological rationale for why VOCs may be produced in each of those diseases? Which there is, but again, you need to run the studies. So we're running those trials at the moment. We published results from the liver study last year, actually. And I think what was interesting about that study is that it was the first time we applied a technique that we've developed called exogenous VOC probes or EVOCS probes.
It sounds very complicated.
It's pretty simple, actually. So when you look at breath, there's a lot of chemicals on breath. So it's kind of just objectively those compounds are there. And they are a mix of compounds produced in the body, so volatile endogenous metabolites, but also exogenous compounds, so stuff that originates from the outside world, comes into the body and out again. So this can be things you've been exposed to, environmental pollution, pharmaceuticals, foodstuffs, et cetera, et cetera. And I think historically we had been, and the field as a whole had been thinking primarily about discovery as it relates to endogenous compounds. So maybe you get lung cancer patients, controls, and saying what are what's gone up and down in those different patient populations that might allow you to build a useful classifier, which kind of makes sense. You have altered metabolism in a tumor even at an early stage.
Yeah.
And we used to kind of dismiss the exogenous compounds as chemical noise. It's like, ignore it. You want to get rid of it in your analysis. But actually, there was a few interesting observations that we made in the field where you could flip it around a little bit and think about, rather than ignoring it, actually, can we deliberately administer a compound that is going to target a specific pathway or disease process that you can then get a bit of a readout on breath? So that's what the EVOCS probe concept is. And if you think about it in the context of early cancer detection, in my mind, the analogy, it's a bit like Imogen. If you think about a PET scan, for instance, for substrate, you have enhanced uptake in the tumor, and that highlights that the tumor does have an altered metabolism, but also the principle of using exogenous substrates to target. So the question is, can you get rid of the $20 million scanner, and rather than put someone into the scanner, can you release a compound that's going to come out of breath if the probe sees a unique characteristic of the tumor? So I think that as a general concept is very, very powerful, actually, because it makes it easier in the sense what you're looking for from a compound standpoint, and actually it's unique, so you tend not to see it in the background. So that means you have a whopping great signal compared to what you normally see in the background. So there's a lot of advantages there. It means you need to develop different skills and disciplines within the business, because you need to think about, okay, well, what's the biology I'm trying to target there, what's the types of substrates and probes that I might want to administer in the body. And the work that we published in liver disease towards the end of last year used a very safe probe called limonene, which is found in foodstuffs. You find it in citrus peel and all sorts of things. And the hypothesis there was that if you have a diseased liver, when this VOCS probe goes into the body, it's not being metabolized as effectively as would otherwise be the case. And limonene's interesting because it's lipophilic. It tends to build up in the fat compartment within the body. So that means you get an accumulation over time. So the hypothesis is that if you've been exposed to this and you have liver disease, you should see much higher abundance of limonene on breath. And that's indeed what is being shown in our study and some of the academic partners that we work with as well. So I think that's exciting because it demonstrates that breath biopsy can have some utility within liver disease, NAFLD, but also more broadly, the use of VOCS probes I think is likely to give you much higher clinical sensitivity and specificity in other diseases, including cancer.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting because I think most people would think it's about measuring what comes out of your body and in your breath, and don't think even further about, as you describe, what can you put in and then see what happens in response to that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's great to hear where you are at this stage. It's still, I guess, a challenge of changing diagnostic pathways is not easy. I mean, there's always been a certain way for many years in many cases, and you have to engage, I guess, with leading key opinion leaders, the medics. So are you planning ahead around those kind of areas as well?
Yeah, we are, and there's kind of two parts to our business as it stands now. So we have a commercial research products and services business. So that's where we have the ability to collect and analyze the sample. And actually, beyond the applications we're interested in, we realized that academic and pharma partners have a whole host of other problems where they are interested to see if VOCs and breath might have utility. So actually, that's good in the sense it allows us to generate some income today, but actually it helps to explore the application space to answer the question of, will VOCs work in application A or B? And the reality is it'll work in some areas, but not others. So it's a very efficient way to try and explore the application landscape. But actually what we also find is it's a way to build awareness with key opinion leaders around breath, VOCs, or technology as well. And then when we look at the clinical trials that we run, so that's again where we will put our investment behind running large scale clinical studies. I think, again, we focused on areas where there's a real clinical need and a pretty good rationale for why VOCs would be present. So I think there's typically a high level of excitement from the clinicians and the academic that we work with in those trials. But that being said, obviously the data will be the data at the end of those studies, and then you still need to overcome, as you say, all the regular hurdles to adoption, getting reimbursement, and getting uptake as well.
Yeah, and I guess it's when you've got a technology you're excited about, I guess it's tempting. You probably get approaches from companies saying, well, can we look at something in this area? And the temptation is maybe to say yes, 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 and spread yourselves too thin. So do you find as the company grows, you're having to more often say, well, that's interesting for us, but we're focused here?
But I think that's what's nice about our research products and services business, because we can say to those customers, hey, you can use the technology to do that interesting piece of research. Because the reality is, obviously, serendipity plays a role in a lot of things. A worry that you'd have is that, again, you don't know at the outset what applications VOCs will have most utility in. So by having a commercial research products business, it allows us to say to those groups, hey, you don't know if there's going to be a VOC, but actually you can just buy the products, do the studies, and see what there is. And that obviously has huge benefit for us as well, because it means that we can look at data and say, actually, in respiratory disease, we think there's a really strong signal there. And then we can start to put our internal investment behind what we think are the best bets both from a clinical need perspective, but also from a technical probability of success perspective.
Yeah. So what's your ambition at the moment in terms of, if you take one of the lead therapeutic areas, when would you hope that you have something that's more mainstream clinical use and being used for early detection?
Yeah, so I think for for the different areas that we're working in, they have very different risks associated with them. So early cancer detection is the riskiest, but the payoff is the largest, both from a patient perspective and commercial perspective. But there we need to do large scale clinical trials, and it will take time. At the other end of it, we've got good data already in liver disease, so actually that feels closer to market, both from a technology and a commercialization standpoint. And in respiratory disease, we've recently launched a research use only panel there. So over the years, having run quite a lot of studies for customers like GSK and AstraZeneca and academic groups as well, we've got a lot of good insights into VOCs that we think are very relevant in respiratory disease. So we put these together into a target panel and are now offering that to pharma and academic customers, where there's a very clear rationale for why that compound may be relevant for them. So that will allow them to explore questions like, will this drug work for this particular patient or not? So the responder, non-responder question in respiratory disease. So that, I think, is a nice stepping stone, because it kind of builds on studies that we've run already. We can get additional clinical evidence in partnership with these customers over time. And then the last area where we've got an interest, and we're very optimistic we'll have tests in the marketplace this year, is around digestive health. So if you think about, again, where in the body are VOCs being produced, airways, liver, and the gut tend to be the kind of machines of VOC production, if you like. And there actually you have some pretty well validated biomarkers, things like hydrogen and methane already have been in use for a while. So we think those biomarkers plus VOCs, so things like volatile fatty acids, we think will have a lot of relevance in gut health. So our hope is that we'll have initial tests which are being used by patients and by clinicians in the marketplace this year, with the others following, assuming the trial's already planned.
And how much does reimbursement factor into your thinking? Because again, if you compare to classical pharma, regulatory approval trials is one thing, reimbursement is another, which can be quite complex in your sort of area.
No, I totally agree. I totally agree. And that's actually, we kind of think about the risks in a sequence of, what's the wolf in the room today? What's the biggest risk? And I think in the past, it was basic stuff like, can you get the technology working? Can you collect a sample? Can you increase the number of compounds that you see on breath and discovery? So I think we've made really good strides there, and we've made really good strides on the, does it look like there's a genuinely valuable biomarker here on breath with either endogenous or VOCS probes? So again, I think we've made a huge amount of progress on that question over the last year. So I think we're at an interesting transition now, where it's saying, okay, it looks like we can get these tests into the marketplace. So how do we make sure that we address the question of reimbursement, the appropriate regulatory strategy? So that's a big focus for us at the moment, actually.
And the other question then is about linkage to care, because obviously if you are detecting disease earlier, that's only beneficial if there's then a clear pathway to benefit from that. And I guess in some areas like solid tumours, it's fairly obvious in a sense of detect it early, get into surgery and get it out. But other areas, it's less obvious. So are you involved in some of those discussions as well about linkage to care?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We tend to think about those applications where it's quite clear what you do next if you get a test back that's positive. So particularly in something like lung cancer, again, where most people present with late stage disease. So it's about managing the disease and using some of the more expensive therapeutics to try and control the disease as long as possible. The reality is, if you can pick it up high sensitivity and specificity at early stage, you can use techniques that have been around for 100 years, chop it out, and survival chances are a lot better. So I think that's a clear example of where how you treat the patient is obvious and has both cost and patient benefit there. I think in some of the, when we think about respiratory disease, that's interesting because I think there's probably most economic benefit, if you like, at the later stages of the pathway when the patients are going to be going on to the more expensive biological drugs, and you still have a high non-responder rate. But that's actually a smaller overall patient population that you'd want to be doing the test there. In an ideal world, you'd want to be doing the test much earlier in the pathway. So, for a patient coming through the door that they have a particular inflammatory subtype, and therefore they should take this drug at the outset. But I think that would be hard to do anytime soon, because I think it's going to be primarily trial and error until you get to the much more expensive drugs in that case. So that's a bit trickier. And then I think in liver disease, actually, there's obviously a lot of activity going into the development of drugs in NAFLD and NASH. But what you don't necessarily have is a good way to determine, assuming drugs come on the market, whether or not patients are improving or getting worse. So I think our expectation is that you will need a test to both diagnose and monitor progression over time and whether or not it's improving or worsening.
And thinking about the future and kind of where you go from here, you're a tech company, engineering, healthcare. The temptation, I guess, sometimes is there's good academic research in Europe and then it goes off to the US. So do you see that temptation to, we're all going to go to the West Coast and, Tech Valley to keep growing this story?
I think we've been quite fortunate that, in Cambridge, and a lot of the team are from all over the world, really, that, we've got a lot of great talent on our doorstep, because what we're doing is very, very multidisciplinary. So you have right on the hardware side of things, we have to do things like make, the collection devices, reduce the amount of ambient VOC ingress that you would otherwise get in a sample, and that's kind of hardcore engineering type solutions. But then you also need high-end analytical instruments, analytical chemists to run that, and then on the back end, the data scientists and the biologists to try and interpret what does this VOC mean from a biology standpoint. So I think we've our success depends on a multidisciplinary team working effectively together and solving really, really hard problems. And what's been interesting actually through COVID and everyone being forced to work from home is it's actually, I think, made some of the cross-Atlantic work a little bit easier with some of the team that are out in the US actually. So, we've got offices in RTP now. We've been growing the team in the US, both on the sales side and on the science and engineering side as well. So I think we will want to go and find the best wherever they are in the world, but the kind of core headquarters and, the breath biopsy lab is in Cambridge, UK at the moment, and we don't think that will change anytime soon. And that's the world's only commercial breath biopsy lab. We do anticipate opening a US-based lab as well, but Cambridge is our home for now.
It's good to hear that you're staying in Cambridge alongside the other areas. And I was going to ask you about COVID, because it's been a really interesting year, and obviously not to dismiss, terrible toll on human life, and it's been very difficult, but the way it's disrupted healthcare, and I've seen it challenge the way we engage with patients and diagnose, to some degree, it's almost been quite a fertile environment for companies like yours to grow. Is that something that you've observed?
It is. I think COVID has had both positive and negative impacts on us as a business. So one of the negatives was, again, because we work with so many academic and pharma companies, a lot of their trials were delayed and put on pause as a result of COVID as well. So we've seen that slow down, but fundamentally the problems still exist. They need to be solved.
Yeah.
So that's kind of temporary blip that we see. I think two of the more interesting trends that we've seen in the results are, one, when you think about, again, breath as a sample matrix, you have a mix of volatiles on breath, and you have respiratory droplets and aerosols, and that's obviously the transmission mechanism for the virus itself. So we have a lot of active research there, and had been looking at things like proteins, non-volatile metabolites, bacteria, and viruses as well. So actually, I think it is really highlighted to the world the importance of breath as a sample matrix and what's on it, both in respiratory droplets and VOCs. So I think that's been interesting. And a second big trend that we've seen, and this, I think relates both to some of the nearer term tests that we're interested in, but the kind of longer term trends as well, were in digestive health, for instance. One of the clinical partners that we work with, you don't want patients coming into the clinic anymore when COVID is out there. So actually, there's a need for the test kits to go out to the patient. And what's interesting about breath, again, as a sample type, is that it's non-invasive, and you can collect breath samples in a home setting in a way that you can't easily collect a blood specimen, for instance. So I think you see that kind of trend at play within specific applications there, but I think it's a broader, longer term trend as well. So we see that once we identify and validate biomarkers, actually it's not too challenging to think about how you can then collect a sample in a home setting and get that longer term benefit of patient diagnostics for patients.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking of COVID, are you looking at how you could use your technology for COVID detection? Is that something you're exploring?
Yeah, so we, when it all first got started, again, we're like, this is transmitted on breath, what should we look at here? We did, and we'll be publishing this quite soon, we did some work looking at the respiratory droplet phase. So can you collect those droplets, use standard PCR for the analysis after that, but whether or not that's a more effective way compared to using a swab to collect a sample, for instance. I think our kind of assessment was that the PCRs, the workhorse for analysis, was already in place, so you need to kind of work with the existing infrastructure as opposed to totally change things. But again, I think that you have lateral flow tests and saliva-based sampling as well, so it's a little bit more marginal whether or not that type of sample collection actually gets you a big benefit or not. I think there is an interesting question about the transmission of the virus. So again, you can be positive, but some people tend to transmit to a higher degree compared to others.
Right.
That must be through the breath aerosol there. So there may be a question around that, but that's something that we will publish, but don't necessarily think it's going to change what's done today. I think we, and particularly some of our academic customers, were interested in VOCs. Would VOCs be useful in a diagnostic setting? And again, our conclusion was that if you've already got PCR there and you're thinking about community-based testing, that works pretty well. And actually, the kind of sense that we have with VOCs is that you might have the sensitivity, but probably not the specificity, because it's not the types of inflammatory processes and stuff that you see aren't super specific, as opposed to, bam, here's this genetic material that you're seeing with the PCR. So I think that was our initial assessment. But actually, when you look at some of the test needs, where things like turnaround time is really quite important, then actually you can potentially make the case for VOCs playing a role there, particularly as we know things like lateral flow devices, are fine, but don't have the best performance. And I think what was really quite interesting as well about whether VOCs should be present, because you obviously have a 30% of patients who are asymptomatic. There, it's like, would they actually produce any VOCs? What's the mechanism of production? And there were some interesting papers published quite early on in the pandemic. So people on the cruise ships, where they had done CT scans for pretty much everyone there, and actually a very high proportion of people that were asymptomatic still had some degree of observable lung damage on the CT scan. And if you see that, then that gives you a little bit more confidence that you would get some VOC production from inflammation, oxidative stress, those types of processes that could be detectable. So I think, again, it's, things have moved pretty fast with COVID as well. Our ultimate assessment was that, with lockdowns and vaccines, this, is probably going to be a managed situation in the not too distant future. So rather than think about what's a very important need but a transient need now, we said the things that aren't going to change are 1 in 2 people are still going to get cancer, and the vast majority of people are still going to be diagnosed at a late stage. So let's make sure we stay focused on areas that we think can have a really long-term positive impact for patients.
Yeah, that makes sense. And anything else that is coming up in the next sort of 6 months to a year or so from your perspective that you can share or to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so I think the respiratory panel that we've launched, we're very excited about that, because again, I think it's the really tying together both what you've seen empirically, makes sense from a biological standpoint, and putting it into a very cost-effective panel that can be integrated by pharma and academic customers into a whole host of studies, so they can very quickly say, will VOCs help me determine responders, non-responders, yes or no, in a very cost-effective way. So we're excited by that. And I think as well, the having the first test on the market around digestive health, very confident that will happen this year. And then I think the last bit, we are running on the cancer studies, lung cancer study in particular. We have some very exciting evoke probe strategies there as well, where we target specific characteristics of the tumor, see an evoke probe coming out on breath. And some of the preclinical work that we've done there has shown that across different histologies, about 90% of stage 1 cancers have the mechanism that we're targeting with our evoke probe. So that's very exciting, because that would suggest that the sensitivity would be quite high, particularly when compared to something like liquid biopsy. So again, it's fantastic liquid biopsy, and just early detection is a big push at the moment, but I think there's still a long way to go sensitivity wise for stage 1 cancers. But with this evoke probe approach, we are optimistic that we'll see both the sensitivity, but also you don't observe it in the healthy tissue around the tumor as well. So that implies the specificity should be quite high as well. So that's a very exciting study using the evoke probe in lung cancer that we think will give you, again, completely non-invasive test, but much higher sensitivity and specificity for liquid biopsy.
Yeah, and as you say, I mean, there's a lot of great advances in cancer therapy, but late stage cancer is still a big problem, and detecting it early is the best solution, isn't it, to try to really tackle that problem?
Absolutely. I think that's, if you could magic one change in the cancer landscape, it would be pick it up early.
Yeah. So let me just come back to, I mean, it's great to hear more about the work that you do. Let me just come back to you and sort of your journey for the last few questions. Because I guess, when you come into this, you've got that technical expertise, you're driven by that passion. What you're doing at the start of this is very different to running an almost 200-person company. So what does a typical day look like for you, if there is such a thing?
Yeah, so it has changed a lot. And I think one of the things I hope that we've done well is try to bring in, the right people with the right experience at the right time. Because again, the challenges that we've, had to solve over time have changed and will change again in the future. So I think, we've had a kind of core team that's been there for a long time with high degree of trust, a lot of technical skills as well. And then as we encounter these new challenges, we build up the team with new experience. So I think that's been something that's been both a focus and a priority for us, and that will continue to be the case.
Yeah.
I think for me, really the kind of two big things I think about the most are the biomarker question and those key applications that we're focused on. Some things like lung cancer, what are the experiments, studies, and trials that are helping to move the needle in terms of the performance of that biomarker. I think if we can do that, then the problems that are after that are all solvable. How do you deal with labs, et cetera, are solvable problems. But if you don't have the biomarker, you will never have the test. And then on our research, products and services part of the business, to me, it's always about kind of pushing the performance envelope. Because if you can maximize the number of compounds you can see repeatably on breath, then your chances of finding the biomarker, should it exist, is higher. So, and that's ultimately what those customers want. So it's both pushing that performance, making that investment over time, because it helps both the customers, but it also helps us remain competitive over the long period of time as well, because we've had to solve a lot of problems over the years to get to the performance that we're at now. And that is, I see, a never-ending journey. You'll always want to keep investing, always want to keep improving.
Yeah. And if you go back to the start of this journey, I mean, is there one thing you could pick out that you wish you'd known or been more proficient at when you started Owlstone Medical, or even Owlstone?
Yeah. So again, I have made plenty of mistakes in my time. I think the one thing that always surprises me is how long it takes.
Yeah.
And even now, say, all right, we're going to do this experiment or develop this particular device or whatever, we can do that in 6 months, 12 months, whatever it is. And then things happen, basically, an unexpected results, bit of data doesn't make sense. And I think you just need to kind of roll with it and kind of synthesize it into an updated plan. But I think it's, I've been really surprised at how long it takes for these things to happen. And there's a large degree of, impatience, in the sense that the early detection problem needs to be solved, but equally you need to balance that with making sure that you're absolutely sure that things are working as they should be, high confidence in the data as well. So I think it's a lot of the challenges are fun as well as frustrating.
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. I think even what people perceive as overnight successes in healthcare or elsewhere are not. It's a marathon, not a sprint. So I guess the last question along those lines is, what gets you out of bed every morning? What still really drives you, having been on this journey for many years now?
Yeah, I think it is feeling that we're making progress to what I think is towards a profound problem.
Yeah.
So again, in my mind, the early detection problem is the one to solve in cancer. And they need to better get patients on the right therapies in things like respiratory disease, I think, are really, really important problems to solve. So I think despite the difficulty, despite the days where the data doesn't make sense and it's, oh my God, it's just I think feeling that we are making progress towards that important problem is very, very motivating, actually, both for me and the rest of the team, because I've had the experience of my wife being diagnosed with cancer, but it's it's a very common story. A lot of people in our company have had a direct cancer experience, or someone in the family as well. So I think that it is a kind of common mission to unite around and just work hard to try and solve it, despite what the problem may be.
Yeah, well, I definitely wish you continued success in that. So, Billy, look, it's been great speaking with you. Thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Paul. Cheers now.